Okay, in this set of videos, I'm going to start talking about something that's extremely important and will be a major focus going forward in the course, which is how to analyze the structure of arguments, how to notice that structure, how to describe that structure in different ways, and how to start to kind of pick apart the different parts of arguments and how they fit together in more detail than we've done so far. So the topics that I'll cover here are listed on this slide. This is just to provide a kind of table of contents for the rest of the videos. Okay, let's start out by doing an exercise. In a moment, I'll ask you to just pause the video and try to put this argument into standard form. It's okay if you don't do it perfectly. It's a little bit more challenging than some of the other ones that we've done. But after you've done your best with it and written out your answer, then start the video again, and I'll give you the answer as to how I would represent it in standard form, and we'll start to talk about some other features of the structure of the argument. So go ahead and pause the video now and try to put this argument into standard form. Okay, I think the best summary, just using the techniques that we've learned so far, is the one that's contained on this slide. So ideally, your standard form summary would look something very similar to this. Notice, however, that there's an interesting relationship between the premises in this argument, okay? So the sentence that's listed at the end here, therefore the United States must not be allowed to buy permissions to produce these gases from other countries. That last statement there that is marked as the conclusion in the standard form summary. It's pretty clearly, it shows up at the end of the standard form summary as the main conclusion or the conclusion there, because it's pretty clearly the thing that all of the other statements in the passage are intended ultimately to support. It's the thing that the person who has written this passage or it has, spoken this passage, it's what they're probably trying to convince us of most of all. And everything else in the passage is supposed to be evidence for that conclusion. And that's why it deserves to be put at the end of the standard form summary as the conclusion, the main conclusion of the standard form summary, okay? But notice that there's an interesting relation between the premises that show up above that conclusion, namely that some of these premises are serving as support for others. So premise 2, it's vital to negotiate reductions in the production of the gases which are doing the damage, is supposed to be, it seems, a conclusion that's drawn from the first premise, and that's indicated in the original passage with the word so in the first sentence. That word so is serving there as a conclusion indicator, telling us that sentence 2, what we've labeled as sentence 2 in the standard form summary, is a conclusion drawn from, or a conclusion that's supposed to be supported by, the first claim that's made, the one that's listed here, that's labeled here as claim 1. Okay, and likewise, claim 3, we need an international agreement under which countries reduce the production of such gases, etc., is supposed to be a conclusion drawn from the previous claim. Okay, so and the fact that that is itself a conclusion is indicated by the word thus in the original passage, which is serving as a conclusion indicator in this case. So what we have here is a case where some of the premises are themselves conclusions drawn from other premises in the argument. We have a kind of structure where the first premise, or the first claim, I should say, is serving as evidence for the second claim, which in turn is serving as evidence for the third claim, which in turn is serving as evidence for the conclusion. And the terminology we use to describe this is that the final conclusion listed, claim 4 here, the one that's supposed to be the main conclusion of the argument, we just call the main conclusion. and the conclusions that are drawn on the way to supporting the main conclusion we call the intermediate conclusions. Now I mentioned earlier that claim 2 is being supported by claim 1 here, and claim 3 is being supported by claim 2. Okay? Now when I mention those things, I'm describing something very important about how the argument works. Because after all, what arguments are is sets of claims where some are intended to provide support for others. And which of the claims are intended to provide support for which others is very important for understanding how a particular argument works. And when we do standard form summaries, it's very useful. Sometimes, really, I mean, for our purposes, it will soon be required that we indicate which of the premises are intended as support for which of the other premises or which of the conclusions, whether intermediate conclusions or final conclusions. And one of the ways we can do that is by using what I call inference tags. This is a very common procedure, basically to put in parentheses after some either intermediate or main conclusion in an argument, to put in parentheses an indication of which earlier claims in the argument that claim is being supported by. Okay, and so these are what we'll call inference tags. They're listed here on the slide as the from 1, from 2, from 3. I've highlighted them so you don't miss them, but you don't have to put them in bold or highlight or whatever in your own work. But you would want to put them in brackets like this at the end of the claim and just indicate where it comes from. I use the word from in these slides. Sometimes I'll use the word by 1, by 2, by 3. That's not that important. What's important is either from 1, from 2, or by 1, by 2. We'll use inference tags in a number of slightly different ways as well that give additional information, but here is a basic model for this example. Okay, let's look at a new example. Okay, so once again, let's do the same thing. Go ahead and in a moment pause the video, do your best to summarize this argument in standard form, and after you've done that, start the video again and I will give you the correct answer and we'll talk about the structure. And again, it's okay if you don't do this perfectly, but you want to do your best to try to do it as perfectly as you can. Try to do it correctly. Don't be discouraged if you don't do it correctly, because we're still learning the tools that we need to do that in order to do this correctly. But go ahead and try to summarize this argument in standard form, and then when you're done, you can start the video again and I'll give you the right answers. Okay. Okay. I think that this is the best standard form summary based on the tools that we've developed so far. What's most important, and probably the first thing to do when presented with an exercise like this, is to ask, what's the main conclusion? What is the one claim out of the whole paragraph, the whole passage, that is most the thing that the author of the passage probably wants to convince us of? Okay, so what is the one main takeaway that they want us to be convinced of by everything else that they say? And in this case, it is basically a version of the last sentence in the paragraph, which is, we should no longer use dissection of animals to teach students in the biology classroom. That's the claim that's being argued for most of all in this passage, and everything else in the passage is intended as evidence for that claim or as support for that claim. Okay, so you can capture that, and you can capture each of the claims that's being offered as support for that last claim in the way I've done on this slide. And we can use our new technique of inference tags here as well, but notice that the structure is very different here. In this case, we have really 3 different pieces of information, or 3 different bits of evidence, each of which independently supports the conclusion. By independent, I mean they don't rely on one another. They don't, none of them needs for the others to be true in order for it to be true. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3 are each offering independent pieces of evidence or independent lines of argument, you could say, for the conclusion. And a way to express that with inference tags, the way I should say, is to say from 1, 2, and 3 independently, or by 1, 2, and 3 independently. Okay, you would want to indicate that the support is being provided by each of those claims independently rather than jointly, and we'll distinguish independent support and joint support in just a moment. Now, the relations that are communicated with inference tags can also be communicated visually with something that we call arrow diagrams. Basically, inference tags and arrow diagrams express exactly the same relations between claims within an argument. They just express them in different ways. Inference tags are expressing those relations in the form of little additional notes to each of the to some of the claims within the argument, telling which other claims are intended to support them and how, that is independently or jointly. And arrow diagrams indicate those relations of support between claims in an argument by using numbers standing for each of the claims and arrows which indicate which of the claims is intended as the supporting one and which of the claims is intended as the supported one. Okay, so if we were to represent our first two examples with arrow diagrams, we could do that as I've done on the slide here. Notice that in the first case we have what we could describe as a chain structure going from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, and from 3 to 4. In the second case, we have an independent support structure. So we have 1 supporting 4, 2 supporting 4, and 3 supporting 4, but each of them doing it by its own sort of line of argument, its own path from that premise to the conclusion.